It's just a drop in the ocean.
It doesn't make a difference in the grand scheme of things.
We aren't responsible for global climate change.
Until now, major new fossil fuel projects in Australia have avoided direct accountability by claiming their emissions are negligible relative to global outputs.
We're told that each new coal or gas mine won't make a difference to global average temperatures, and they can't be blamed for any damaging impacts.
That's no longer possible thanks to a groundbreaking effort by 6 Australian universities, and in this episode, the researchers themselves are here to explain their work.
My name's Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick, and I'm a Professor of Climate Science at the Australian National University in Canberra.
I'm Iain Strachan, a former journalist turned science communicator. We're members of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Weather of the 21st Century.
And this is Totally Cooked, the Climate and Weather podcast.
Yay!
Woo.
Woo. So, today we're joined by Associate Professor Andrew King of the University of Melbourne and by Dr. Georgy Falster of the University of Adelaide. My co-host Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick has her science hat on because she was among the co-authors of the work we're talking about. How does it feel to be talking about your actual job for once, Sarah?
Yeah, pretty good actually, but I'm pretty nervous to be honest. I'm so used to being silly and stupid on this that I don't know if I can switch back to real science mode.
Do you think like major new gas projects and damaging climate impacts are not silly and stupid?
That's a trap. I don't know. I have to know.
If you can't laugh, you'll cry, right?
That is exactly right. Yeah, they're not ideal. I'll put it that way. We shouldn't be doing them. Yeah.
Let's look into that a bit more deeply then, shall we?
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Georgy, thank you for joining us on Totally Cooked, your podcast debut with 21st Century Weather.
In fact, my podcast debut overall. Never before have I participated in a podcast, so thanks for having me.
Very
You're
exciting.
in for a wild ride.
Yes.
So, to summarise briefly for the listeners and the viewers at home, and before we go into more depth, Georgy, what is this research about?
Well, so when an energy company, or that's what they like to be called these days, a fossil fuel company, when they want to renew a fossil fuel project or start a new one, they have to submit a proposal to the government that details that project's emissions and the associated impacts. So the first part of that is quite straightforward, but until now there hasn't been a framework to quantify the actual real-world environmental and societal impacts of one particular project's emissions. So the project itself, the infrastructure, yes, but the emissions, no. And so what that means is that what happens currently is that energy companies will just blithely state that their project's emissions are negligible, quote unquote negligible, in the context of global warming and therefore must have inconsequential or unquantifiable impacts. So what we've done with this new piece of research is to show that this is absolutely not the case. In fact, you can simply take a project's stated lifetime carbon dioxide emissions, translate that into an equivalent amount of global warming, and from there lean on just a huge body of existing research that links certain amounts of global warming to really awful impacts, like people dying from heat exposure, loss of corals on the Great Barrier Reef, all sorts of things. And so with this research, we've stepped through the process using one particular recently approved new gas project in Australia, which is Woodside Energy's Scarborough Energy Project.
Thank you very much.
That wasn't briefly at all.
I think actually that was
good.
pretty good, yeah.
That was really good. I'm like, yeah, that was awesome.
One of my favourite podcasts is In Our Time by the BBC, and they often, will say some poor person gets the job of being like, okay, can you please summarise the plot of Wuthering Heights as quickly as possible? And it's like, yeah.
Angry man does stuff. Women die.
That's better than theirs. So, yes, you mentioned that it's the Scarborough project that we're looking at. What is the Scarborough project extracting?
So through the Scarborough project, Woodside are producing something called liquefied natural gas, or LNG. which chemically, if we want to be a bit sciencey, it's mostly methane with a little bit of ethane, which has been cooled into a liquid form for easy transport. It is worth noting at this point, possibly this will be important later, that methane itself is actually a very strong greenhouse gas, about 20 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But one of the things about this project is that gas, like LNG, is often, you've probably heard this, it's often spruiked as quote-unquote clean energy, because compared with burning coal, it does produce less carbon dioxide. I think about half, maybe, compared with the amount of energy produced. But, of course, it's still a fossil fuel, and burning gas still produces carbon dioxide. It's certainly not clean or low carbon or any of those other nice things energy companies like to say about it. Yes.
And how long is the Scarborough project projected to last?
I think it is, as of most recent documentation, it's currently slated to start in 2026, so next year, and last 30 years, so with decommissioning scheduled for 2055, which that blows right on through Australia's target, recently announced, to reduce emissions by, 62 to 70% by 2035, and even our legislated commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. So this project, as currently stands, will still be producing millions of tonnes of gas per year, even after the nation as a whole is meant to be producing on average zero.
That's a very good segue for my question to Andrew, which is, we're meant to be reaching net zero by 2050. So why are we still commissioning major new gas projects? How does that fit in with those targets?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I would also question why such projects with such long lifetimes are being approved. We know that Australia is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, both domestically and through exports. But as Georgy was saying, we've got these targets to really greatly reduce emissions within the next decade now, and then get to net zero by 2050. And this is a project which has quite substantial greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, to the point that as we get nearer and nearer the net zero target, it will take up a very large proportion of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And beyond 2050, we're going to need to be, any emissions we make, we'll need to be offsetting, and offsetting really well. So not just doing something which will temporarily take up carbon, but actually offsetting in a really permanent, durable way. And that's not really being discussed very much, and something that, especially with these projects with long lifetimes, should really be considered properly.
I think we're going to come back to that later. I kind of feel like what you're referring to, carbon capture and storage, is a bit like my, monthly and yearly budgets, and like hoping that mum and dad will give me loads of money for Christmas, because I'm definitely spending more than is coming in, and maybe some magical solution will arrive later to sort me out.
Yeah, that's actually how I approach my budgeting too. I'm like, it'll be fine, but I don't have parents to bail me out. We've got to maybe sell children or do something more drastic.
Or it's like the only thing that my partner and I can possibly do as people, without any money stored by, despite being in our 30s, is desperately hope for the lotto. That's what we do. We sit at home and daydream about how amazing it would be if we won the lotto, and that just solved all of our problems.
So what we're saying...
Do you buy a lotto ticket, though? Like, I used to have this dream too, but we don't buy lotto tickets.
Which I feel like is quite a good metaphor.
For
carbon capture and storage.
So we've established that Australia's net zero targets are as rigorous as a millennial's budget.
Yes.
We're homeless.
Not our fault, though. It's not our fault. The boomers.
Renting and going from paycheck to paycheck. Okay, that's healthy. Sarah, you worked closely with the lead author, Neroli Abram, of this paper during your time together at ANU.
Yes.
And Sarah left ANU... Sorry.
No. Incorrect.
Not yet. Not until I get her fired. Nerily left ANU to take up a role at the Australian Antarctic Programme, where she's now protecting the penguins and the ice sheets from the warming caused by things like Scarborough. So can you tell us, in her absence, when and where did the idea for this research first come about? Do you remember?
So when Nerily approached me, this work had was already underway. And I believe she'd been talking to different law firms about how we can actually show the direct link between carbon emissions from fossil fuel projects and real world impacts. And from the conversations I had with her, I used to think that this was just something we couldn't be done. Like we the amount of effort and data and analysis that would have to be undertaken just was not feasible. It's not something that would be done in our lifetimes. But Nerily figured out a way to do this, and it's actually a really simple way to do it. It's based on comprehensive science, and it's based on peer-reviewed science that's already out there. But yeah, the lead up was basically around projects that were being approved and the lawsuits that were coming up against them. And as we mentioned in the opening, a lot of these projects, almost all of them in fact, say our emissions will be negligible in terms of global climate change and corresponding impacts. In fact, the Woodside project, when it was brought up in court about its impacts, and some impacts were listed, not necessarily based on this work, that was basically seen as redundant because they didn't have to mention impacts beyond their local site. So laws do need to change there to keep this in mind. But yeah, it was, I think, a labour of love for a while, but as it progressed and more scientists came on, we could really see the value of this. And to be honest, the first time Nerily showed this to me, I was like, but this is so simple. Why haven't we done this before? The methods used and how it's been basically, we've pieced it together in the middle, bringing these different methods together. It was almost like this is just so silly of us as climate scientists not coming to this realisation earlier. So I'm just amazed that she had the ability to pick this out and to see it through, because it would have been really hard at times.
And we might touch on it a bit later, but there have been some legal challenges to this Scarborough project by the Australian Conservation Foundation, which was withdrawn, and Doctors for the Environment, which I think was chucked out of the High Court. Basically, as far as I can tell, and this might be where we should have a corporate lawyer on the show, but we don't, basically chucked out because an environmental analysis had been done, and that was good enough. The fact that the analysis was pretty insubstantial is kind of incidental to the legal process. The legal process had been completed, therefore full steam ahead. And I guess we would hope that this kind of research will make that a different conversation in the future.
Agree. Yeah, and look, already there's been interest from many different law firms. I've talked about this work, as has Nerily, as has Andrew, I think, and maybe Nicola as well, about what this means, and they're very interested and thirsty for more so they can fit into their lawsuits. And, at the end of the day, we want to make this available to everyone. So even the fossil fuel projects themselves can then research, well, what will be their quantifiable impacts if this does go ahead.
Okay, so the research states that the Scarborough project will emit approximately 876 million tonnes of carbon dioxide over its lifetime, and that based on the calculations in this research, that will cause 0.00039 degrees of additional global warming. So Andrew, over to you. Sorry for putting you on the spot about this one, but how did you and the team arrive at those numbers? What is the process that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a number that sounds quite small as well, but it's related to a concept called the transient response to cumulative emissions, cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. And put simply, this is based on the idea that for every tonne of emissions we have, we cause about the same amount of warming to the planet. So it doesn't really matter when we emit that tonne. It has roughly the same overall effect, the same incremental effect on the global temperature. And because we've got this kind of linear relationship that allows you to make estimates for a given amount of emissions, how much warming you'd get as a result.
Okay, so Andrew, this work is based on that kind of TCRE that you've mentioned. What are the numbers involved in that formula? How are we doing those calculations?
So, as we were saying, every tonne of emissions causes warming, and the numbers work out that for roughly every 1,000 billion tons of emissions, that's almost half a degree of global warming. About 0.45 degrees of global warming is our best estimate. And this fairly simple relationship we can then use to work out for different amounts of emissions how much global warming they would cause, including all the way down to this kind of project level emissions, how much global warming is associated with that.
And so, Sarah, if I understand your point correctly, that formula has already existed, and that's what's being used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change when they calculate, the sort of the process of global warming. But am I right in thinking that no one has ever thought before narrowly to apply that to individual fossil fuel projects?
Yeah, that's correct. So really, like, the essence of this formula and this understanding has actually existed all the way back in the 1800s. And we talked about Svante Arrhenius in the 1800s, who basically quantified the relationship between more carbon dioxide and the temperature warming, right? So it's based around that theory and what was developed in the 1800s. Around about a decade ago, a bunch of climate scientists came together and really nutted down the specifics of that number based on observations, based on understanding of climate and weather dynamics, how the ocean uptakes heat, looking at climate modelling, and refined that number to the one that Andrew was talking about before. So not only was it proposed 200 years ago, but we now have a much more refined understanding of it. And what Narrowly did was basically bring that into the picture along with different climate impacts. And we looked at impacts that we know have a relationship to global average temperature. It's been proven in the scientific literature. So from them on, we could just fit this transient climate response to cumulative emissions to the extra impacts a given project may cause.
And I think I read in some of the coverage about this story, it may have been in the Guardian article, I can't quite remember, or in the ABC, that the work done here was referred to as an example of climate attribution. Now, is that actually correct, or is that a slight misunderstanding of what's been done here?
Do you want to have a go at that, Andrew? What's your view? I'm interested to actually hear your view on this.
I would say this is a form of climate attribution. It's going further than typical attribution studies have gone, including ones that Sarah and I have conducted in the past. So fundamentally, attribution is thinking about the causes of a change. And in this study, we're thinking maybe almost in the reverse of how we normally think about attribution, where we're looking at a source of emissions and thinking about the impacts that can cause. Whereas with most attribution analysis, we're looking at an event that happens or the outcomes of an event, and then linking that back to carbon emissions. So it's almost kind of like the reverse of a typical attribution analysis, but I think it kind of fits within the general theme of attribution.
Yeah, look, I would agree with that. It's not a typical it's not a classical attribution study, is what I've said in the past. And by that I mean, the early attribution assessments looked at how climate change affects a weather event or a trend in a weather variable or climate variable. What this is doing is more firstly on end-to-end attribution. So you go down from the cause all the way down to the impacts. It's not just looking at the middle part of the weather and climate influence, but it's using different methods. And in all honesty, the field of attribution has expanded in terms of the methods that have been used quite rapidly over the last decade. So it doesn't matter that it's not classical attribution. It's extended the field, if you will, to look at it in a bit different way and to include impacts as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think that's when I read that, I thought, oh, is that wrong? I was thinking more about attribution as in, did climate change make this weather event worse, or this season worse? But this is kind of more using it to project or predict the future.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, yes and no, but yeah. So what you just mentioned then was extreme event attribution, which is another subfield of attribution. And what this study was doing, I don't even know if there's really a term for it yet. There's so few studies like this, and this is the first to look at individual fossil fuel projects. It's more down the line of impact attribution or end-to-end attribution. But yeah, I'm not sure if it deserves its own subgenre of its own. Maybe time will tell.
Could be.
But I think, but like building on that and the previous discussion, I mean, this is sort of how I explained it to my mum yesterday, actually, which is that like with this specific paper, which is sort of a new thing, the point is that, to be calculating emissions and impacts from individual projects, like that's not, knowing the amount of emissions that the companies have always had to report that. But in terms of the impacts, like I think all the tools were there. It just took the brilliant and very solutions-oriented mind of Nerily Abram to sort of gather up all that relevant information and write it up in nice, simple terms that energy companies and government agencies, lawyers, as the others were saying, and can now use along with the neat example, because I think the trick was really showing that even though the warming from a single project is a teeny, teeny, tiny fraction of a degree, the impacts of 1 whole degree or half a degree of global warming are so enormous and catastrophic that even a tiny fraction of that is still terrible. And the world just needed someone to point that out in a research paper.
Agree. I think it's also important to highlight, though, that maybe a decade ago we couldn't do that because there wasn't sufficient evidence or research on impacts and how they directly relate to global warming overall. It's not to say people weren't interested in it, but we just didn't have the tools and the base knowledge to do those sorts of studies. They've just, expanded so much in the last decade, which is absolutely fantastic. But yeah, certainly having that brilliant mind to link all of the pieces of the puzzle together is what has made this study so possible.
Now, gone are the days of an apple falling on Newton's head or, people splitting the atom. But in terms of your particular areas of climate science, is this something of a eureka moment? Like when Nerily explained it to you, you're like, oh my God, wow, that's going to be huge. Like, is it to that extent? Or is it more of a very effective innovation?
So I've had 2 reactions. I mentioned one before, but my first one was like, can we really do this? Is this really possible? And then straight after was like, well, this is a bit of a no shit Sherlock. Like we got there. And I think the no shit Sherlock is not in the brilliance. Like it did take that Nerily's brilliant mind to bring it all together. But when she did, it was just, to me anyway, it was obvious and it was simple. The beauty is in its simplicity. It's based on hardcore comprehensive science. It's almost like, why didn't we see this before?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I might
That's all right.
just chip in. I completely agree with Sarah. I think there's an elegance in the kind of simplicity of this method, which hopefully means it has more impact because it's, often if we do something and it's quite complicated, people don't fully understand and it can kind of slip under the radar. But this is something where it's quite a simple method. We can very clearly link emissions to an impact that people care about. So I really hope that it actually, drives some important change.
Can I add in there that we are actually developing an online tool that's based on the research of this project. We're not just going to focus on the 3 impacts that are in the paper, but expand to others that have evidence that they relate directly back to global warming. And the idea is you could basically pick any emissions that you might be interested in, whether or not it's related to an individual project or a big fossil fuel company or even at the country level. You just feed that into the tool and it tells you the extra impacts that amount of emissions will have on certain categories. So that's in development now. I've got a wonderful research assistant, Claudia, working on this right now. And hopefully that'll be up and running in the next 12 months. And it's there for anyone to use, whether it's lawyers putting their cases together, politicians, and even the companies themselves so they can better understand what damage they really are doing.
What are you going to call it? How fucked are we? The stuffedometer?
Stuffedometer. God, that's a really good question. We haven't actually brainstormed any names yet. I'm all for how fucked are we, but I'm not sure if that'll fly. I'm not sure if certain funders of the project will be happy with that.
You should speak to some kind of branding expert who comes up with pithy turns of phrase on the spot.
Like you? We'll see. We'll take this offline. We'll see what we can find out.
So I'd like to look in a bit more detail at the projected impacts of the additional warming that's going to be caused by the Scarborough project. And staying with you, Sarah, because heat waves and extreme heat are your speciality.
I guess they are. I do research, whatever that is now. Anyway, continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Thank you. That's so fine. So how does this paper connect the emissions from Scarborough and its additional warming to heat-related impacts?
Yeah, cool. So it's not cool. It's actually really hot. The analysis that we looked at here was looking at heat-related deaths over Europe. And we've already had some questions, well, why didn't you look at heat-related deaths over Australia? But that's because the data and the analysis was already there, looking at European deaths related to heat. Unfortunately, if we don't have the impact analysis already done, we can't relate it back to this transient climate response to carbon. So there was this study that came out, I think it was late last year or even early this year, and they basically had all their data there using epidemiological models and climate projections to work out how many extra people will die in future heat waves over Europe. And it's a very comprehensive analysis, lots of great data, lots of great scientists working this field. So from there, we could work out, well, if we just warmed the planet by 0.0039 degrees Celsius, which is the warming Scarborough will cause, how many extra people will die during heat waves in Europe towards the end of the century? And it turns out that's just shy of 484 extra people. That's our best estimate will die simply because of the Scarborough project alone. Now, that's important to remember. That's just for Europe. That's just for extreme heat. So you can imagine that death signal, if we looked at it globally, if we had the data to do that, would actually be much higher that we can directly attribute back to this particular fossil fuel project. But again, it was based on the fact that the data was already available and it was an already well-researched impact for that particular region.
And I suppose that also strikes me as a very neat kind of element to the research as well, is that there's already this innovation that Neroli has achieved, but then you've been able to couple it to research that very good research that someone else has already done and just kind of tweak the numbers specific to this project. So that's pretty clever too.
It is, yeah. And I think the beauty, if you can call it that, of studying heat-related mortality is there is so much research on this particular topic that has expanded significantly over the last decade or so. You know, we work with epidemiologists now who can understand this risk better, and our climate models are so much better now at projecting the information we need on the scales on which we need them. So, yeah, it's really brought these two parts of science together really, really, really well.
And to clarify or to reinforce what you said there, you know, you haven't chosen Europe because we have a sort of Eurocentric view of the world. It's more that the data for Europe is so rigorous and available that it's a really good fit for using in this context.
Correct. So conversely, or I guess on the same line of thought, there was something like 850 European cities went into that analysis, that underpinning analysis, whereas a part of that same data set, there's only 3 cities that represent Australia. So we just don't have the scale of the data to do the exact same impact analysis here in Australia. It's not to say we can't do any at all, but we'd have to think a little bit more differently as to how we looked at heat-related mortality over Australia in relation to increasing global temperatures.
And I think I remember reading that a lot of those deaths projected would be in Southern Europe, which obviously has a warmer climate than Northern Europe, but it's pretty worrying to think about what these impacts would be in places in the world that are traditionally warmer anyway. So I'm thinking of the Middle East, I'm thinking of, you know, parts of Asia. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to extrapolate out how bad the amount of deaths we would be expecting to experience there would be under this kind of warming.
Absolutely. And also think about population. There's a lot of much more densely populated cities in warmer climates as well. And a lot of the time there's a lower adaptive capacity in those regions too. So undoubtedly, this sort of signal that the Scarborough project has on heat-related mortality in other locations will be much bigger than what we see for Europe.
I'm going to come back to heat and talk about it in a different way in just a moment, but I wanted to ask Georgy about one of the other major impacts that have been looked at in this research, which is the impact on the Great Barrier Reef as another, Earth system element that we know a lot about, that we have really good data on. Can you tell me a little bit about what the study looked at there, please?
Yeah, so the Great Barrier Reef, I think you're listening will know, it's a coral reef that runs down like the sort of the northeastern coast of Australia. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's protected by Australian law, for what that's worth these days. But of course, I think you probably know that climate change is already hurting the reef. So there've been 6 or so severe mass coral bleachings in the past decade alone, and we can confidently attribute that to ocean heat waves that have been caused by global warming. So like Sarah was saying with the heat waves, the science on this is very secure. We know that the hotter sea temperatures on the reef can be attributed to global warming, and that is what has caused these mass bleaching events. And actually, it turns out it's reasonably straightforward to translate a certain amount of global warming into the severity of marine heat waves over the Great Barrier Reef, and therefore the number of corals that are exposed to this too hot water that causes them to bleach and ultimately die. And so in this case, sort of armed with our estimate of the global warming that is directly attributable to the Scarborough project, we can translate that into additional heating over the waters of the Great Barrier Reef. And it turns out that that heating will kill off between like 5 and I think it was 37 million coral colonies in the coming decades. And so and just think about it, like in the context of what we talked about at the start, these are the sort of environmental impacts, 5 to 37 million dead corals that, without this framework we're producing, are just being waved through the approvals process as negligible in the environmental impact statement. And then the other thing I want to say, of course, is that with this and everything we've talked about, I mean, Scarborough, that's our one case study. I mean, it's maybe sounding like a bit of a scapegoat, but these impacts are the same for every single fossil fuel project, including those that are already operating. So, I mean, coral's going to die. It's just how many more?
And that's just the Great Barrier Reef, because that's, what was chosen in this study that we have such good data on, not including Ningaloo Reef, which is obviously closer to Scarborough in WA, and then all the other coral reef systems around the world that are at such risk of these increased ocean temperatures. And the number that's kind of picked out in the study is the average of what you've just said there, Georgie, like 16 million corals with each mass bleaching event. And it's not just 16 million a year or 16 million every 10 years. It's every time there's a mass bleaching event. That's approximately how many we would expect to die on just one reef system. So it's it's pretty scary.
It's full on. That surprised even me. Like, I was shocked when Neroli first said that number. The heat-related mortality, I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds really wrong, but that seemed to make sense to me. But 16 million individual corals with every mass bleaching event between now and the end of the century at least, that's enormous. I can't believe, I can't believe that we're allowing these projects to be waved through with that sort of impact on the natural ecosystems alone.
And I mean, if you think, even if you haven't been to visit the Great Barrier Reef, I mean, you can probably picture it, maybe a clump of 3 to 4 coral colonies. I mean, I've been there quite a bit. I teach courses there. I mean, they're beautiful. There's, they're always teeming with fish. You quite often see things like sea turtles, sharks, whales. There are these incredible ecosystems. So it's not just that millions of corals will die, but everything that relies on these beautiful ecosystems, they will also be lost. Fish, turtles.
We might get a fact check from producer Zach in the corner of the screen, but we were looking at a social media clip from our episode about the Great Barrier Reef, and I think the fact that I remember is that not just the Great Barrier Reef, but reef systems around the world constitute 0.1% of the ocean, but are home to 25% of all the kind of marine biodiversity. So they, are not only disproportionately vulnerable to global warming, but are also disproportionately important to marine biodiversity.
And the Great Barrier Reef kind of gets it on all sides because so it has this sort of, we could call it an indirect effect where the fossil fuel emissions from all projects heat the water, cause bleaching events. But there's also runoff from the actual sort of coal mining projects that happen in Queensland. And that's reducing the reef's resilience to things like marine heat waves as well. So this poor World Heritage site is really getting it from many directions.
Sarah, you mentioned that, compared to coral reef die-offs, the deaths we expect from heat waves in Europe, not so many, but much bigger numbers, are going back to your area of extreme heat, is thinking about how many people, not necessarily dying, but are going to be exposed to very kind of unhealthy, almost unlivable conditions. Can you talk to us a little bit about that part of the impacts research, please?
Yeah, that's right. The third impact that we looked at in this study was how would the Scarborough project change who or what lives in the human climate niche. And this is basically a temperature range where it's basically considered safe for you to live. It looks at what the average temperature of a climate zone is. I think I might need to be corrected, maybe Zach, if you can fact check this. I think the uppermost limit is 29 degrees Celsius. So if you live in a climate where the mean average temperature is above that threshold, it's not a very good climate to be. And that's not to say that every day is 29 degrees Celsius, because most people can operate okay in that, except you maybe Iain, coming from Scotland. But it's more about the variability around that. If the average is 29 degrees, you could get heat waves that are 45, 50 degrees Celsius. So that needs to be kept in mind. And so what we were able to show is that an extra 500,000 people will be exposed to extreme heat or unprecedented heat for that locality, simply due to the emissions from Scarborough alone. So that's, to put it in perspective, I live in the ACT, Canberra's in the ACT in Australia. That's more than the population of the ACT. So basically it's shifting all of us into very extreme temperatures that this climate should not be experiencing effectively. And that's pretty rough. And on top of that, it also means that the emissions from Scarborough also mean that 356,000 people will be pushed permanently outside of this safe climate zone or human climate niche. So they'll live in climates where the mean average temperature is above 29 degrees Celsius. And as I mentioned, you can't really operate that well in those sorts of conditions regularly. And so it puts more people at risk of heat-related mortality and also heat-related morbidity. So diseases or ailments that are induced because of the hot temperatures.
And, we've probably got our Australian metropolitan city hats on here where we can put fans on or put air conditioning on or stay in the shade during these kind of conditions we're talking about. But I think it's really important to point out that a lot of the people around the world who will be exposed to these borderline unlivable conditions will not be able to escape that heat as easily or comfortably as people in very advanced economies will.
Absolutely. So again, that adaptive capacity in some areas, a lot of areas actually in the subtropics and tropics, is already very low. And once you warm those climates, just that little bit more, that's all it really takes, that will drop even further and can have really disastrous impacts, even from just one fossil fuel project.
So we talked a little bit in the introduction about this, but I want to go in a bit more detail now into our carbon budgets and net zero targets and the magical thinking that seems to be able to make Scarborough compatible with those targets. So yeah, just to reiterate, the federal government in Australia recently set an emissions reduction target of between 62% and 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. So we have 9 years to get down to that level.
Easy.
Yeah, very easy, very, very simple. And then net zero by 2050. And Andrew, net zero is one of your areas of research expertise, particularly what will happen to the climate when, I'm not going to say if, when we reach net zero, and depending on how quickly we get there. So let's have a think a bit more about how a project like Scarborough fits in with Australia's emissions reductions target. And I know that you said at the start, not sure how, but it just seems so incongruous to be setting those targets at the same time as pressing go on stuff like this. What's your take on it?
I completely agree. It seems to be at odds with the fact that we need to reduce our emissions. Really, especially given how challenging it may well be to remove carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere, every ton of emissions that we can avoid, we should be really pushing hard to do. So approving big projects like this, or any kind of fossil fuel projects, really it is questionable in my view, given it's just going to be so.
I'm just gonna call it. It's outright wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. If we're serious about reaching net zero, we should not be approving these projects. Period.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's so at odds with what we need to do. Really, this is the greatest threat to how we live, to humanity in general, and to the Earth system for the next century or two. That our emissions are causing the climate to change so greatly, and all the impacts that come with that. So to be approving any fossil fuel projects should be, really interrogated very intensely, and any kind of needless emissions we should be seeking to avoid.
And it seems like Australia in particular is relying heavily on the potential for significantly scaling up carbon capture and storage technology to make these two rather incompatible positions somehow fit in the future. So I know that this isn't your specific area of expertise, but can you tell us a little bit in simple terms about what carbon capture and storage is and how it works at the moment and how it may work in the future? Fingers crossed.
So the basic idea around carbon capture and storage is that you can take carbon out of the air and put it somewhere else, either in the biosphere or in the ground. At the moment, there is a massive amount of work being done to explore lots of options around carbon capture and storage. Of course, we do have natural systems that do this. Trees photosynthesize, but plants photosynthesize, take up carbon and store it. But to do it in a way that is feasible on a massive scale beyond what the natural world does is a massive challenge. And it has to be done in a durable way. So planting trees or any kind of vegetation, but that vegetation then burning means that the carbon is being lost back into the atmosphere. And really, with lots of these projects, the challenge is in the durability. Having something where you store the carbon permanently or close to permanently is really the big challenge. So there are some projects around trying to do this in an artificial way through direct air capture. And at the moment, it's really expensive and can only be done on quite a small scale. So to then have plans where we continue to emit carbon, including emitting carbon well beyond when we should be reaching net zero, it seems crazy, really, when we don't really have the technology at the moment to take up carbon, very efficiently on a big scale.
There were some cheap headlines in the media here in Australia recently from a visiting American political scientist who was criticizing Australia's National Climate Risk Assessment and saying that some of the scenarios used in it were science fiction. It seems to me that a much more suitable use of the phrase science fiction is carbon capture and storage at the scale that we're talking about, like sucking carbon-filled air out of the atmosphere and putting it under the ground. Like, I don't know enough about it to comment in an informed way, and I think we're going to have some guests on in the future who do know more about this, but that does seem a little bit far-fetched.
In fact, I can just jump in here just for a sec because I'm teaching this currently to my cohort of second year geochemists at the University of Adelaide. So I think, and possibly Woodside may even agree with this, in some cases there is a place for carbon capture and storage to a degree. And so where it is often said to be used, and in fact I would say used as social license to operate, is when you pull the gas out of the ground, a very small amount of actual pure carbon dioxide comes out with it. And that is something that the petroleum industry has always had to deal with. That's not new. It has to be cleaned out so they can sell the gas. And so the way they often try to do this is to pump it back into the ground and try to get it to turn into something like a carbonate, like a type of rock, which is then stuck underground. So a lot of the research into this is trying to figure out ways to scale that up. Actually sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, that is currently, I think, science fiction. There has been one very high-profile test of this carbon capture and storage at scale in Australia called the Gorgon Project, if anyone's listening or wants to look that up. Thus far, it has been a very public and very expensive failure. They've been getting a tiny fraction of the carbon stored up that they wanted. The one place I'll say it is quite useful, and you can probably edit this out, but it's a little factoid if you need space. So this carbon capture and storage, it is a very neat way to offset the emissions from renewable energy production. So my favorite example is there's a geothermal energy production in Iceland where they've got some very hot land, and there they've set up a very effective carbon capture and storage. So they catch the carbon dioxide that comes out of the ground while they're producing geothermal renewable energy, then pump it back down into the groundwater where it turns into carbonate and it's locked away. So that is the context where we can say, yes, carbon capture and storage is good. It gets rid of the carbon dioxide associated with renewable energy. For, 876 million tons, which is of greenhouse gases, which is to be produced by this project. It's not even in the conversation. There's no way to capture and store that. The only way we can not have that in the atmosphere is to not put it there.
Well said, Georgie. Thanks for clarifying. Sarah?
Georgie, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I swear I've heard before that it's 10 times more expensive to take carbon out of the atmosphere than what it is to just not put it there in the first place. Is that right? Or is the number higher or lower?
I would be astonished if it wasn't higher than that. Because carbon capture and storage is absurdly expensive because you have to drill the hole, make sure the carbon's sitting there. These are expensive operations.
Yeah. Maybe it was 30 times. But yeah, it was a higher number, right? So maybe let's just not rely on this Band-Aid solution. Maybe.
I mean, for those who now have burning questions about the actual practicalities of carbon capture and storage or sequestration, like me, so I can tease the fact that we're recording next month with Roger Dargaville, who's in the engineering faculty here at Monash. We will get a different view on things, a bit more of a technical engineering view on things very soon. But for now, I want to move to looking ahead at what the academic and sort of social impacts of this research will be. So we have this methodology now for demonstrating that emissions from individual projects are far from negligible. Sarah, what do you hope this research will achieve?
Gosh, this is a loaded question. I've been asked this a lot, but
I was the first to ask you.
You probably were because of all of the media lead up that we did. But in any case, the main point of this, and I think it's not just actually about what I or even we want, it's what Neroli intended for. This was her baby. She saw this through. And it's all about accountability and transparency. We just want to show that these emissions matter. It doesn't matter the scale on which they're emitted. They matter, and they matter for impacts. They matter for people. They matter for ecosystems. And it's that accountability of if you go to court now, if you write an impact statement saying, oh, no, the impact is negligible, well, we can actually prove otherwise. And it's not necessarily to stir shit up and to be a problem causer. We want to be problem solvers that, here's, as I said, we're developing a free tool that anyone can get in and use and work out, well, what impacts are they exacerbating and why, where is that actually occurring? So it's it is for that transparency and accountability. It's not for academic gain, hell, definitely not even personal gain. It's just to, hold these companies accountable, hold these projects accountable, and move forward so we can actually reach net zero effectively and quickly as well.
Thank you. Andrew, how realistic is it that work like this will be taken seriously by governments or by courts when considering cases brought against fossil fuel projects?
You got the hard question.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I'm not sure I can say if it will be. I think it should be. It adds a scientific basis, to these decisions being made. At the moment, there is a lack of accountability, and there's a mismatch between what companies can say about their projected emissions from their project plans and the impacts that those emissions actually have. So I think this is really improving the process and making it much more robust, and strengthening the process as well. So I'm hoping that governments see this and incorporate this in their decision making.
And Georgy, last question comes to you, which is, do you expect other researchers around the world to pick up this methodology and start applying it to other projects in other regions? Do you think this is going to gain momentum? What's your expectation?
Well, I think you have to ask the researchers, but I would hope that in maybe the most minimal case, so as Sarah and Andrew described, so we did these calculations, we figured out the amount, this, little fraction of global warming that would be directly attributable to this particular project. And then we used the brilliant work of other researchers to translate that into impacts. So the heat-related deaths in Europe, people pushed outside their human climate niche, corals on the Great Barrier Reef. My hope would be that all the people doing these sort of studies would then sort of, as the last sort of flow-on point of their research, use this sort of approach to say, well, to contextualize, to say, well, these are the big global impacts, and here is the fraction of that could happen at a particular project. I'm not sure. I think so. But I think one of the wonderful things about this study is that it really transcends academia. I think a lot of the impact of it is going to be for people who are doing the real work to push the renewable transition. So that whether that's lawyers, government agencies, and I feel like I'm not taking the side here of the energy companies, but right back at the start of this discussion, we talked a little bit about why, what Scarborough is, why it exists. Ultimately, it's for Woodside to make money. It's to create value for the shareholders. What we really can't do as people who care about climate change is to put the onus on energy companies to drive their renewable transition. Why would we? What I hope with this tool is that actually the sort of the government agencies who are approving these projects, or maybe people who are interested in a more litigation type approach when things go badly, that is where this tool could be useful, the methodology. I'm not sure.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Before we formally conclude, is there anything that we've missed or that anybody really wants to mention that we've overlooked? An aside, final thought?
I think I guess we've already said this, but just to make it really clear, this is not just about Woodside and Scarborough. It's about every fossil fuel project, even those that have been. And if we know how much carbon they will emit, then we can work out their impacts. It's not even just about fossil fuel projects in Australia. It's those overseas too, and those that will probably be put forward in the future. We can do this. We can do it even do it at the country level. So we did use Woodside as an example, and that's because it's been in the public discourse recently. It's had all of these cases, these law cases thrown at it. So that's why that was chosen. But it's just one example, and we can do this for all, and we should be doing this for all fossil fuel projects now.
Yeah, very important disclaimer.
That's super important, I think, because a lot of the media attention, I think, around this has been very focused on Woodside and Scarborough. And I actually, reading the articles about our research, I think that almost misses the point a little bit. It was a case study to show an application of this, but it's every single project that is renewed or approved in Australia and elsewhere. They're a bit unlucky to be our scapegoat, but it's every single project. I do quite like to have a bit of hope sometimes.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Which generally is that, so like, you know, even we as climate scientists or climate interested people, like, we are also practical people. I think I certainly, and I suspect Sarah and Andrew, Iain, like, we recognize that of course we can't immediately stop extracting fossil fuels. I mean, new projects are not great, but of course, like, over the past few decades, fossil fuels have just wormed their way so thoroughly into every aspect of our lives. We're not saying, you know, from tomorrow, like, turn off the gas taps. But what we can do, and I think what this work shows it's important to do, is to be directing, you know, more and more resources, both intellectual and financial, into the renewable transition and focusing on that rather than commissioning new gas projects. I mean, like, humans, we're an amazing species. Like, we're really capable of great things. I mean, we've managed to become so reliant on fossil fuels in mere short decades. So I personally am confident that with enough political will, we can do the reverse. I fully agree with you, Georgie, especially with the, like, change takes time. It is so very slow, but we've got to do it. Like, let's just start it already. I just don't know if I have the positivity with the political will. We can do it, but yeah, I'm just looking at all these projects being waved through in our, you know, technically less conservative government. You know, we need to push harder. I know we're all exhausted, but we need to push harder. But then again, this is what this study does. It shows, you know, these impacts, and hopefully it is the push that's, you know, so sorely required.
Love Georgie's positive final thought. Sorry that Sarah ruined it.
I'm so sorry.
Andrew's mouth opened. Is he gonna side with?
Say something positive.
Oh, I wasn't going to say something quite as positive. I mean, this has already been hinted at, but we looked at 3 different types of impacts here, where there's a solid basis of scientific knowledge to make the link with global warming, and then back to the emissions from Scarborough. But this is a massive, you know, underestimate of the impacts from a fossil fuel project. And as Sarah was saying, this is about, you know, with the heat-related deaths, this was about Europe. But we know that the impacts of climate change are so much worse in the global south. There's so much less capacity to adapt. We need more research as well on impacts of climate change in, you know, other parts of the world, for lots of reasons, including for loss and damage as well, but also to really highlight that the impacts are, you know, across the whole world, they're everywhere. We shouldn't just be, I guess, focusing on European heat-related deaths. We did that because the data was there, but you know, we need to expand a bit on the impacts that we're looking at as well.
So just another plug for this amazing online tool that Claudia's developing. We will be looking at other impacts too. But we can't, unfortunately, we can't do it if the data isn't there. And all of these impact statements or assessments look a little bit differently, how they've done their calculations and what data they've used. So sometimes there is an extra couple of steps we need to perform, but we're definitely expanding it to cover different areas, different types of impacts as well, so long as there is a proven link back to global average temperature rise.
Really good points, well made by Andrew. Note to self, Georgie goes last next time.
You really brought it back down, Andrew.
You guys.
As I've said before, I'll just kind of bang this drum again. There's never a reason to not have hope. We can do this. We can do this.
Very convincing.
That's it for this special research-focused episode of Totally Cooked.
Our regular schedule continues next week with an episode focused on Australia's vast but under-researched weather resources.
And then we're delving deep into the psychology of climate change with a behavioural scientist.
To tackle those fascinating topics, plus plenty more to come, join us for the next episode of Totally Cooked.
And we'll tackle the climate crisis together.